Thank you very much, Jeremy. It's a privilege to be here. And I'm going to begin with an apology. Some of you have heard variations of this talk, and I stress the word variations. So there is some new stuff here, but for those of you who've seen parts of this, I apologize. Actually, I could add the priest part and make it a trifecta. I'm not a priest, but I helped start a local synagogue after I moved here. So I know that could be foolish, but in any event. So now people can make fun of me for 3 reasons. Okay, so we're going to begin with a picture. Picture's worth 1,000 words. This picture has actually been reproduced in lots of other places. We originally did it. When I say we, I did it with an economist named Ian Hathaway for the Brookings Institution in 2015. And the blue line represents something called the startup rate. These are national numbers. These are based on government statistics. And the startup rate is the ratio of firms that are 1 year or old or less that have at least 1 employee. And the reason we use that criteria, have 1 employee, at least 1 employee, is that we wanted to rule out lifestyle firms. All right, so this is a proxy for firms that have started and that at least have some ability to grow. That's the idea. And the bottom line is the exit rate. These are firms that leave for either voluntary reasons, could be a merger, or involuntary reasons, they go out of business. And this is the share of those exits as a share of all firms. Now, needless to say, this picture tells a very powerful story. This is a 30-year downward trend in the startup rate in the United States. This is not good. And I'll give you some reasons why in a minute. And what got a lot of attention when this paper was originally published is that the exit rate actually went higher than the startup rate for the first time since the data had been recorded. Those 2 paths crossed in the year 2009. Now, I will tell you that what's not shown here is that there are new data for 2012, and the exit rate and the startup rate are now about equal. So there's been a small pickup on the startup rate, but overall, we still see a decline. Okay, so that is not a good chart. Second, let's hope this works. Okay, so the second thing that Ian and I did is we asked ourselves, well, how universal is this trend? So we got data not only nationally, but across all 366 top metro areas in the United States, including Wichita, and I'll be back to Wichita in a minute. This picture of declining startup rates over the last 30 years was true in 365 of 366 metros. It's true in all 50 states, and it's true in all 2-digit, or these are broad industry classifications. In other words, it's pervasive across the U.S. economy. Now, the one exception, by the way, was a community around Tyler, Texas, and I can't give you reasons why they would be the exception. But this falling startup rate noticeably not only occurred for obviously metro areas in Kansas, this occurred even in Silicon Valley in San Francisco, the hotbed of all entrepreneurial activity. Now, they of course had a very high level of entrepreneurial activity to begin with, but nonetheless, they've experienced a decline too. So this is a problem. Why is it a problem? Well, I would suggest 2 reasons for this. Number one is that entrepreneurs, or at least some portion of them, are the sources disproportionately of disruptive innovation. And when I talk about disruptive innovation, I mean innovations that basically serve as a platform for lots of other innovations, and innovations that, of course, have tremendous long-run productivity enhancement effects. So I'll give you some examples. Think of the telegraph, the telephone, the car, the automobile, the airplane, computers, personal computers, internet search, and air conditioning. All right? These technologies, I would submit to you, are probably at the top of the list, putting aside the advancements in medicines, antibiotics, and so forth. But these technologies, I would submit to you, are what define a modern society or a rich economy. And what do they have in common? One thing. every single one of these innovations was developed by an entrepreneur or a new firm. Now, in fact, there were many firms that started in the automobile business or in the telephone business, and eventually they merged or they went out of business, and eventually they got down to a few, and that's what happens in the competitive process. But the point is that these were not established companies that helped lead to essentially what we have as a modern society. Now, there are some exceptions. I call them the big company exceptions. You can think of the hybrid car, for example, being a disruptive technology that was developed by Honda and Toyota. Or you can think of the transistor, which eventually led to the semiconductor. The transistor, of course, was Bell Labs, and that was the quintessential big company. But those are the exceptions. Largely speaking, large companies do incremental innovation. New companies do disruptive innovation. Not all, but some, and that's why they're important. The analogy that I often use is hockey. The more startups you have is like having more shots on goal. And the more shots on goal you have, the more goals you're going to have. And so that's the reason why we as a nation should care about our startup rate. There's a new book out by an economist named Robert Gordon. Very thick book. I'll spare you in reading it because I'm going to give you the bottom line. Bob Gordon is a very well-known macroeconomist and economic historian at Northwestern. The book that he wrote came out from Princeton Press this year. It's called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. It has two major points in the book. See, I'm sparing you 700 pages, so you should thank me, all right? Point number one, the way a lot of economists measure innovation is something called multi-factor productivity growth. What that means is you take output and you divide it by the two major inputs that we have in our economy, labor and capital. Now, economists have ways of weighting the amount of labor and the amount of capital, but largely speaking, I think it's about 2/3 or 3/4 weight for labor and about 1/4 for capital. And what you do is you compute productivity as the ratio of outputs to inputs. You calculate the growth rate, and the growth rate determines the rate at which an economy advances. Other things being equal, faster productivity is better than slower productivity. So the first finding that Gordon shows is that productivity growth, until about the 1950s in the United States, measured the way he did, ran at around 1.5%, and then in the 1950s, after World War II, it spiked to over 3%. That was the good news. The bad news is that ever since, we've been in decline. Productivity is now down to a growth rate of roughly 1%, down from a peak of 3. That's over 5 decades. So it wasn't just the oil spike in 1990 and 1973, and it doesn't and for example, for those people who celebrate the Reagan tax cuts in 1980, I would argue that was more of a demand-side stimulus than supply-side, even though it was argued as a supply-side mechanism. But even the Clinton era, when we had a noticeable uptick in productivity, we have still had a long-term decline for 5 decades. Hypothesis. I can't prove to you because we don't have enough statistical power to prove this, but the hypothesis is that decline in productivity also coincides with a decline in the national startup rate. I don't think it's an accident that we have not had a recovery in the productivity growth rate because we've had a decline in those shots on goal. So we're not getting the kind of disruptive technologies. Now, I know this may sound strange to you because, think about it. We've had Google, we've had all these unicorns out in Silicon Valley, we've had all this robotics, and everybody's worried about technological displacement and so forth. But put all that aside, even with all that, we still have not had a noticeable increase in our productivity growth rate or a noticeable increase in our startup rate. So the first reason we should care about the national and the regional decline is that it reduces the amount of disruptive innovation that we're likely to see. Second, new firms are a driver of job growth. So when I was at Kauffman, colleagues and I, we did a number of papers, and we calculated something called the net job creation every year. That's gross jobs minus departures. And it turns out, and by the way, we did this by the age of firm. We looked at firms that are less than 5 years old and firms that are older than 5, and we even did it for firms that are 15 and older and so forth. Here's the bottom line of all that research. Through the year 2010, all net new jobs, that is gross creations minus exits, so that would be the net, all net new jobs in the United States economy were created by firms less than 5 years old. Now, this is not small business necessarily. This is not the same as saying most jobs are created by small business. And this is a very important point. Do not confuse small business with new business. Many new businesses are small, but they grow to be big, all right? And that's what we as a society should hope for, is we have a lot more of these growing companies. But in any event, I found this research shocking, that the economy in all the net new job growth, at least through 2010, was in new firms. Now, the data since have not been crunched, but I would suggest to you they probably have not been materially different. Maybe 80%, maybe 70% of net new jobs are still new firms. But that just tells you that if you want to create new jobs and you want productivity advance, we got to reverse that startup rate. And I would suggest to you that one of the reasons why you see so much voter anger right now and so much malaise is because of the slow productivity growth, and also because we have a slow startup rate in the economy. So, why has this happened? I want to make sure I don't go over my time. So this is the big question that a lot of researchers have to focus on. The first thing I'll tell you, it can't be Obama's fault, because when we first came out, Rush Limbaugh touted this study as saying, oh, this proves that Obama's wrecked the economy. And there were a number of other people in his camp who said that. I mean, that can't be true. Obama has not been president for 30 years, at least the last time I checked. So this has been true across presidents of both parties. This is a secular problem. This is not a cyclical problem. That's point one. Okay, point two, hypothesis. I can't prove it to you. I think growing regulation has something to do with it. And when I speak of regulation, I'm not just talking about federal. I'm talking about state and local too. All right, all the stuff you have to go through, whether it's zoning requirements or whether it's licensing. A great statistic that I like to cite is some research that was done by Morris Kleiner, who's a professor at the University of Minnesota. He has calculated that the share of all jobs in the US economy that require some form of license has increased from 5% in the early 1970s to guess what number now? 30%. 30% of all jobs in the economy require some kind of license. A license now, you know, licenses are typically defended, and by the way, licenses are handed out by local government, typically, not state and local government. So if you're looking for reform, this is a place to reform. There are a lot of people working in this economy, and I don't want to single out any particular ones, for which I don't think a license is necessary. People like barbers or cat groomers, or I'm serious. There are, in a lot of cities, require licenses for cat groomers, and you can go down the list. I think one item for reform, regulatory reform, which I'll get to later, is to review all the licensing requirements and see whether or not all these are necessary. But in any event, I submit to you that the growing regulation, however you measure it, over the last 30 or 40 years, has to have at least some relationship to this decline in the national startup rate. Now, that's a hypothesis. Let me tell you what we did statistically. We took advantage of the fact that we had variation across 366 metro areas, and we looked over this 30-year period, and we were able to do some regression analysis, some statistical work, and Ian and I found two variables that explained a little more than half the variation across all cities. And again, what we're explaining now is not the startup level, but basically differential startup rates across the country. The first variable we found out is that population growth, and this sensibly has got to be true, population growth has a positive effect on entrepreneurship, or other things being equal, if you're in a rapidly growing area, your startup rate probably declined less than in other places. And this is true for both demand and supply side reasons. Number one, if your area is growing very rapidly in population, it means that there's a big market there and more people have an incentive to form firms. So that's That's the demand side. And the supply side, by definition, if you got more people moving in, you got more entrepreneurs or people potentially capable of being entrepreneurs. So there's a reason why population growth should be related to entrepreneurship. The second thing, though, may not strike you as readily apparent. We developed a measure of industry concentration by city. And we did it as basically a ratio of the number of firms to the number of establishments. So you can imagine some firms can be very big and have lots of establishments, and other firms can have basically only one location. Other things being equal, cities that have high degree of industry concentration have low rates of entrepreneurship. And in fact, they have declining entrepreneurship. The paradigmatic example has got to be Detroit, right? 3 big companies dominate the economy. Well, they had a very significant decline in entrepreneurship. What would you say about Wichita? Well, Wichita has obviously got a big company. We have Spirit, we have Coke, and we have, though, a lot of other mid-sized and small-sized companies. So we don't look like Detroit, but on the other hand, we don't look like Silicon Valley or San Francisco, which despite the fact that they have Facebook and Google and so forth, Silicon Valley and San Francisco have lots of small startup firms. And so their ratio of concentration is lower than, let's say, it would be here. And that, to us, is a significant variable. So other things being equal, the more concentrated is your city, less likely you are to have growth in entrepreneurship. And in fact, there's a recent edition of The Economist magazine, which showed that across numerous industries in the United States, there has been rising concentration, fewer number of firms. And I would suggest there's a relationship between that and entrepreneurship. Because if you happen to be trying to entering an industry that is highly concentrated, you're probably going to face higher barriers to entry. It's probably going to be more expensive for you to form your firm, and you're probably going to face a lot more regulation, and it's going to be tougher for you relative to the incumbents to crack into those markets. So that's our hypothesis. We can't explain all the reasons why the national startup rate has declined. So there have been various solutions that have been suggested to this. Number one is that there have been various startup acts that have had bipartisan support. You'll recognize 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats there in the Senate. There have been 3 versions of this act that have been proposed in the Senate. The bill has not passed. One of the most important features is to expand the number of visas for STEM graduates of universities. So, I mean, from a national point of view, and certainly at Wichita State, there are a lot of foreign students. It is insane from a national point of view that we have these kids here, they come to our places to study, and then they can't stay. And they can't form firms or they can't work. This is national craziness. And only in this political crazy season would an idea like this not have traction. I'm hoping that maybe after the crazy season's over, Congress can fix this and allow more people who get STEM degrees and also more people who are entrepreneurs, let them stay here, at least have green cards. I mean, put aside the issue of citizenship. We need smart people and we need entrepreneurial people. It's very simple. Another idea is that we ought to consider having a clean sweep of a lot of existing regulations, whether by automatically sunsetting rules, or creating commissions. The BRAC stands for the Base Closing Commission, and the idea is you could form a body of experts at the federal level, at the local level, at the state level, and they could figure out or recommend to the local or state authorities, here are all the rules that are no longer any good, vote up or down on getting rid of them. I suggest that be a good project for people here in Wichita, and it'd be a good project for our state legislature, in addition to our representatives in Congress. And finally, in 2012, there was something called the Jobs Act that actually got bipartisan support and made it easier for new companies to raise funds, and also, for the first time, permitted equity fundraising through crowdfunding platforms. So the Kickstarters are now not only for trinkets and gifts and movies and so forth, but you can now raise equity on crowdfunding platforms. There'll be a big issue about whether or not the rules are too restrictive, but nonetheless, we at least are advanced compared to where we were 4 years ago. I think at the real reform, though, is probably even more possible at the city level. And that's because not only is there gridlock in Washington, but if you look at entrepreneurial activity in all those cities that are listed on that chart, basically all of them were built by entrepreneurs. So why shouldn't policy be primarily focused at the city level to try to encourage more entrepreneurship? It's where we have the network, it's where we have the ecosystems, the venture capitalists, the angels, the mentors, and so forth, and all the talent. All that exists at the city level. So there are some things that government can do, like cleaning house on regulation. There is a lot of obsession about local taxes, but I just have a caveat, and I just want people to notice that some of our most entrepreneurial areas happen to be some of our most high tax areas in the United States. So I do not believe that low taxes are necessarily a cure-all to solving the entrepreneurship problem, because look at those places right there. And I mean, they have some of the highest taxes in the country. They also have some of the best educational systems in the country, infrastructure, and other things that facilitate entrepreneurship. So I think this is very important to keep in mind. And finally, the whole idea of a virtuous cycle. Once you get going, a lot of other activity tends to attract itself to people that are already quite successful. That can win out and can trump, so to speak, no pun intended, that can trump some of these other things like taxes that you would otherwise think may hurt entrepreneurship. Now, what can Wichita do? Well, it turns out that relative to the national trends, I know I'm running out of time, and so I want to basically get to the bottom line. Wichita was below average in 1980 relative to all other parts of the country in startup rate, even though we celebrate ourselves as a very entrepreneurial city, and we are still below average today. That's the bad news. I'll give you some good news in a minute. But here are some cities that have done some remarkable things to become a lot more entrepreneurial in the last 30 years. A footnote, 30 years ago, Austin was Wichita size. Today, Austin is 1 million people, and we're at about 500,000. I mean, that tells you that entrepreneurship and getting your act together at the local level can really transform a local area. Although I wouldn't take Austin's traffic, all right? Now, we have some advantages. We have cheap real estate. We have engineering talent here at the university. The fact that S&T Media, a company that's gotten a lot of publicity, moved here from San Francisco in large part to take account or to take advantage of our software talent plus our cheap real estate, is perhaps a canary in a coal mine. Maybe there will be more companies like it that will move here. And we do have a resurgent downtown. Jeff Fleur, I remember, told me at one point that I think sometime in 2017 there will be over 4,000 people living downtown. And that compares to 5 years ago, maybe less than 1,000, maybe even less than that. So there are trends that are encouraging in Wichita. They're even more encouraging if we look at the next slide. And most of the people in this room know the initiatives. In fact, many of them are involved in these initiatives, whether it's in the Entrepreneurial Task Force, the fact that we have an accelerator here, Wichita Technology Corporation, which is basically started out several years ago and got money from the state, now works with the university and has angel funding and also venture capital funding for high growth companies. 1 million cups, I can go on and on and on. The founders of this are in the room here. I played a small part in working with some people to bring this. And by the way, how many of you have been, I'm just curious, how many in this room have been to a 1 million cups demonstration? So you know what's going on. And for those of you who haven't, you gotta go. You just absolutely gotta go. There's just some amazing things that happen every Wednesday morning. At least one, if not two, great entrepreneurs in this local area will knock your socks off. We had a great presentations yesterday, and I'm just telling you, week after week, and if we have time for Q&A, I can talk about them. And finally, we have, as you know, the BREG 8 industry task forces that are working on collaborative efforts to produce advances in innovation. A couple final things. I want to tell you that Wichita State University, can be a focal point or a hub of a resurgence in Wichita, just as universities have been hubs in the resurgence in those 3 cities that I showed you right in the first bullet. Pittsburgh, Albany, and Akron have all been resuscitated to some degree by universities. Universities are places where companies and new companies, whether old or new, can feel comfortable because of the open environment. As you know, many companies tend to be very closed, especially for IP reasons, but somehow there's some magic in the air when you come to the university that people, they share ideas. And universities, as a result, have been hubs. And there's a great book that talks about this called The Smartest Places on Earth. Get it on Amazon. And it talks about Albany and Akron, and I just added Pittsburgh. Now, an important point about these cities is that each of them leveraged a particular technology. In other words, it wasn't a scattershot of things, but each city took advantage of a comparative advantage that it had to basically attract existing firms and also foster the growth of new firms built around universities. And we are poised to do that on our innovation campus here at Wichita State. So we have big companies that are coming here, but we also have the opportunities for entrepreneurs in the makerspace that will be on the campus. President Barton's so-called I-35 strategy, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's basically to attract kids all up and down I-35, all the way from Dallas, all the way back up to Kansas City, get them to come to Wichita, get more talent to come to this city. And the more young talent that we have, the more likely it is that some of them will stick after they leave Wichita State and become the entrepreneurs that will help lead this city forward in the next century. I want to advertise one particular thing that we're going to be doing on June the 1st at the Kansas Leadership Center, and I want everybody to sign up for this once you get information about it. It'll be publicized within the next month. We're going to have a Health Innovation Ecosystem Summit, and we're going to be showcasing a number of the technologies and entrepreneurial activities in the health space that a lot of people are not aware of, and we think that this is the first step toward perhaps building a health innovation ecosystem. Footnote, most of these technologies that you will see at this really cool day that's going to be on June 1st have been originated at Wichita State. Again, underscoring the central role that a university can play in bringing together the entrepreneurial talents that are here. And so I leave you with one final question. Remember I told you the cities that have resuscitated themselves, they built themselves around a particular technology or an industry. Well, we are really good at these things, at aircraft, at testing. Wichita State, NIAR, that's what NIAR does, is test aircraft. We're good at manufacturing, and we have an emerging IT cluster here in Wichita. Can we leverage these advantages or these industries into related or adjacent industries so that we're poised to grow Wichita, make it the entrepreneurial hotbed we all thought we once were. We probably weren't as much of a hotbed as we thought, but we still were at least something. Can we restore that kind of entrepreneurial activity in the future? The answer has got to be yes, and I think it's through the leveraging of existing technologies plus the university that we have represented here. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take your questions.